Hey there, I'm Tatetic. I know the Binding Blade is old now, but you should know that I spoil the ending of the game in this video. If you're really worried about spoilers, you can watch the introduction and then skip ahead to part 2. Or, I guess you could just not watch the video. I know YouTubers aren't supposed to say things like that, but you know what? You do you. Fire Emblem the Binding Blade, also known as FE6. Whether you love it or hate it, I think we can all agree that it was a video game. It was an important one too. FE6 brought the concept of true hit to the series. It was the first Fire Emblem game developed by a team without Shozo Kaga at the helm, and it was the first official game to land on a handheld console. FE6 rode on the popularity of the earlier games in the series to become a massive hit in Japan. The game's incredible success, along with the performance of Advance Wars, gave Intelligent Systems the proof they needed to convince Nintendo to take the next Fire Emblem into the Western world. Although that's actually all over the place, including slightly to the east of Japan. In any case, FE6 is nearly 20 years old now, and over the decades many people have examined what they feel are the game's flaws and have made rebalancing patches to try and address them. Hit rates too wacky for ya? Well, you can get this patch that fixes them. Think some units are too underpowered? Get this patch that evens out everyone's growth rate totals. Can't find a patch you like? It's easy enough nowadays for practically anyone to tinker with the numbers in FE Builder, and that's a fine approach to editing a game but doesn't address what I think is FE6's biggest issue of all, replayability. FE6 does have 2 route splits, but they're pretty brief. It has more than a handful of units with basically no gameplay purpose beyond being a meme thanks to their lackluster starts. It has a poorly balanced early game on hard mode, multiple maps that drag on and on for no real reason, and bosses that are uniquely painful to have to deal with. It's a hard game to play twice, let alone the 9 times you need to play it to unlock all of the trial map characters, if that's your thing. So what do people normally do when a game gets so worn out? Well, people overhaul them. Overhauls are large-scale game modifications, or mods, that completely change the way a game works by altering its major systems. Skyrim is the 5th Elder Scrolls game and one of the most modded games in existence, so it shouldn't surprise you that it has a bunch of overhaul mods, like Requiem, which focuses on roleplay and realism by making combat a lot more dangerous and the overall interface of the game more immersive. Or to have into holds, which makes the marriage system more interesting and useful, and also lets you have 11 spouses for some reason. Skyrim is not the only game with overhaul mods. It's a pretty popular modding format across all sorts of games. But my point is that overhaul mods don't try to create an entirely new experience from scratch. They take what already exists and reimagine it. The reason why I bring this stuff up is not because Todd Howard has a gun to my head demanding that I convince you to buy every release and re-release of Skyrim. Please send help. My actual point is that Project Ember, the FE6 ROM hack that this video is about, is an overhaul mod. It doesn't just do one thing in particular. It does a lot of different things. Reviewing it requires looking at all of the changes it makes as one collective package and deciding whether it succeeds at providing a new experience. Let's start with the main reason why most people outside of Japan know about FE6's existence in the first place. Part 1. Roy's our boy. Fire Emblem's most refined, clever, and frankly elite fans refer to the series as anime chess. This provides me a useful excuse to create an analogy that connects chess to other 600-year-old games, such as the Binding Blade. Roy is the king of FE6 in the sense that he's an incompetent fighter, a slow mover, and his death ends the game. Roy's appearance in Project Ember, on the other hand, is quite a bit different. He's not a king in the chess sense anymore. He's got a higher movement range, he's got slightly better base stats and growth rates, he starts with a hefty C rank in swords, he's generally more competent in combat now. You still lose if he dies, of course, and he's hardly invincible, but he's no pushover either. Roy's not only a lot more mobile, but he's easier to risk on the front line, either in combat or to support key units. Ideally both. In FE6, the events at the end of Chapter 21, or ideally 21X, include Roy's promotion, but it's entirely artificial. Compared to the vast majority of promotions in the series, it has zero aesthetic appeal. He just changes into mirrored Roy. Narratively speaking, it doesn't really matter that his class name is different. It's solely focused on the gameplay ramifications of promotion, getting more stats and more weapon rank. As far as FE6's narrative is concerned, the most important aspect of this event is that Roy gets the Binding Blade. Several games in the series play with the trope of giving out weapons for story reasons in one way or another, and it's not just Fire Emblem that does this. Plenty of games do this, and it's easy to see why. It lets the player make a psychological connection between two things: some narrative element that the game's writers considered important, and the fun of murdering people with their new weapon. In the case of the Binding Blade, it enables Roy to follow in the footsteps of Heartmoot, who took pity in Idun due to the fact that the dragons turned her into a demon and such. Now Roy can not only avoid killing Idun, but help ensure her divine soul is restored. This matters way more to the narrative than Roy becoming a Great Lord. Project Ember cuts through the pretense of a pointless late-game promotion. Now you can just have Roy use a Night Crest. That gives him access to lances, a sizable stat and weapon rank boost, a cool horse, and of course more movement. In Project Ember, there's still no narrative meaning to Roy's promotion, but at least it's significant from a gameplay perspective. It also comes with an opportunity cost. If you want to promote Roy early, Your other cavaliers and knights will have to wait patiently for their own promotion, and if you decide to promote Roy late, he'll find it harder to defend himself, but your other units will be better at protecting him. Unlike FE6, Project Ember actually provides an interesting choice here. Personally, I prefer promoting Roy around Chapter 8X or Chapter 9, because Roy just contributes so much more when he's promoted, and it's nice to have extra movement and a Durandal on Roy in the Western Isles arc. Just a friendly tip for you if you want to try the game out yourself. But here's the thing. Project Ember doesn't just change Roy. It changes every playable unit and enemy unit with one focus in mind, tilting the phase balance of the game to emphasize the player phase. That means everyone's attack power is increased and everyone's defenses are reduced. This is combined with a change to weapon hit rate reliability. Now weapons not only hit more often, they hit harder as well, and avoiding damage is far more important to a player's enemy phase strategy. Combat success now heavily relies on either getting the first hit in or being able to shrug off damage with various tactics and resources available to you. To adapt to the new player phase focused paradigm, any playable units start at different levels, or can use different weapons by default or on promotion. Some units even get personal weapons. They also usually have their bases and growths changed to give units a more well-defined purpose. For example, take Bors, the only Fire Emblem unit whose portrait I would bring to a barbershop. But more importantly, he gets access to swords in Project Ember. Now Bors can take on axe users a lot more easily, and he's now in a smaller pool of units who can tank physical damage reliably. This makes Project Ember's early game a hell of a lot more tolerable in comparison to FE6's messy first few chapters. Also, Deke starts out as a level 10 mercenary holding a hero crest, kind of like Jarek in FE8. You can immediately promote him in Chapter 2, and on a Maniac mode you probably should. That enables you to trade Lot's hand axe around between Deke and the Axe Bros, which makes clearing the eastern part of the map a lot easier. Overall, FE6's wide gap between its bad units and its best units is a lot narrower in Project Ember. No bad unit becomes so good that they're better than the best units in the game, and no great unit is so nerfed that they're worse than the other units. This doesn't mean that every unit in Project Ember is top tier. Far from it. There are a fair amount of units that underperform compared to their peers, but the overall average viability of the playable cast is definitely higher now. Like, it's still kind of a meme to use Wendy or Sophia in Project Ember, it's just less of a meme than it was in FE6. You can get away with it in both games, but using them in Project Ember just feels a bit more rewarding a lot more quickly. Incidentally, this makes Project Ember a really fun game to Iron Man. Not more or less so than FE6, but definitely new and different, given that it's a bit easier to replace a fallen character that you relied on. All of that said, the downsides to using certain units are largely the same as in FE6. For example, let's say you choose to over-rely on generals who can now use bows. You'll have to contend with their low speed, which ensures they won't be able to double as many enemies as your other units in the late game. High-powered classes also tend to lack defenses, relying mostly on dodging, and the increased hit rates on various weapons makes that tactic less reliable. Units that have access to more than 2 weapon types usually have some sort of drawback, like lower base stats or difficult growth rates. Douglas is perhaps the most extreme example of this, given his 0 growth rate in HP or defense. You can cap his HP and defense by giving him exactly 2 dragon shields and 2 angelic robes, but this comes at the cost of those same items not going to your other units. There are benefits and drawbacks to using Douglas in this way. You get an incredibly tanky unit if you do this, but at the expense of someone you really want to keep alive, or someone who can run ahead a bit more. Then there are the newly playable units, which are often either unplayable FE6 characters or characters from FE7, which add even more options for how you decide to play the game and who you bring along. They all fit into the game as if they were there in the first place, with a few new supports, as well as roles that make them immediately useful. This is yet another major way in which Project Ember establishes replayability. What this all boils down to is that Project Ember increases the importance of the player's agency. The player phase emphasis isn't impressive or meaningful on its own. What actually matters is how the phase balance of the game informs your tactical and strategic decisions as a player. This goes beyond simply deciding whether or not you leave a unit in the enemy's range. It affects which units you choose to use consistently or for a single chapter. It affects which weapons you purchase and how you distribute stat boosters. It affects how you go about stealing items, recruiting units, and similar turn investments. Project Ember takes one of FE6's biggest strengths, unit distinctiveness, and makes it play to the game's advantage a bit more by making more units feel more useful, not just by changing those units and the weapons they wield, but by changing enemy units too. In a way, Project Ember's version of Roy is a microcosm of the changes done to the roster, but addressing these changes to units alone is not enough in analyzing Project Ember, because the patch overhauls so much more about FE6. Next, it's time to take a look at one of these changes in particular and carefully consider, Part 2. 2 to 3 bow range is pretty good, actually. I've noticed a running theme in criticisms of Project Ember. They tend to focus on one specific feature of the overhaul. The feature that probably gets the most flack is the fact that bows have a range of 2 to 3 now. It's a very sweeping change. There are enemy bow users in every map, and that changes the dynamic of playing all of these chapters. Multiple playable units can use bows, especially thanks to Project Ember giving units access to more weapons as previously discussed. Being able to attack from 3 range fundamentally changes those units' utility. Of course, it gives the enemy a wider attack range too, and if you forget to account for it, it does lead to your units getting shot to death faster than, I don't know, something that gets shot to death quickly. But the all-encompassing nature of giving bows this longer range is actually what makes it all work. This is where people I've talked to about Project Ember start to get a bit skeptical. And, fair enough. My taste in game design has led me down some dark, dark roads. So I'm going to make a quick assertion before I go further. In criticizing any form of media, including games, targeting one element of a piece of work and using it to condemn the entire thing is poor practice. In games criticism in particular, doing that tells us nothing about how a game works on a practical level, because games are made up of multiple systems that work together to create an overarching gameplay experience. So outside of circumstances like a game being a completely buggy pile of crap, it's how well or how poorly these systems work together that help determine whether a game is fun to play. If you were reading IGN in 2014, you might remember that review of Pokemon Alpha Sapphire that listed too much water as a con. Yes, it's a very easy thing to make fun of. So much so that it became a meme at the time and led IGN to take the whole pros and cons thing out of future and past reviews. But those who actually read the review itself got the context. Callie Plaga was saying quite clearly that there's an overabundance of water Pokemon to fight. There's Team Aqua's Pokemon lineups and all of the wild Pokemon and swimmers you run into while surfing. Her point was that Alpha Sapphire incentivizes using electric and grass Pokemon, referencing her overleveled Pikachu to further demonstrate this fact. She drew attention to this because Pokemon as a series is all about building up a strong team of Pokemon that you like. So it's odd that there are these obviously optimal choices, and choices you just had to throw in the trash. But some doofus editor working at IGN summarized all of this as too much water, and it all went downhill from there. So, back to Project Ember. Criticizing the bow range change in isolation isn't sufficient. It's like saying too much water about Alpha Sapphire without any of the context about type balance. After all, this isn't Binding Blade bow mod. Don't get me wrong though, I'm not mocking those who criticize Project Ember in this way. I assume they're intelligent people and experienced Fire Emblem players, and I can definitely understand the hesitation in accepting the change. I'm just saying these critiques are incomplete, so let me try to close the loop on that. 2-3 bow range changes the value of archers. To go back to chess, the game has a system players conventionally use to rank the relative value of each type of piece. In the original valuation, pawns are worth 1 point, knights and bishops are worth 3 points, rooks are worth 5 points, and queens are worth 9 points. This changes a bit between players, that can even change mid-game, and there's also a lot of accounting for the value of combinations of pieces. It's complicated, but it allows players to calculate roughly what they're willing to sacrifice in order to get rid of an opponent's piece. If you lose 2 pawns in an effort to remove a rook, that's a pretty good trade. But if you lose a queen to capture a knight, you should probably play checkers instead. Honestly, I don't know why checkers get such a bad reputation. People who think they're masters of chess look down on it, you goddamn snobs. Checkers has grandmasters too, Anyway, in FE6 and GBA Fire Emblem in general, really, archers are like pawns. It's hard to find a significant use for them because they're not only foot-locked, they're bow-locked too. They only perform reliably on player phase because they cannot counter one-range attacks on enemy phase, and their movement is low also. Arguably, the best archers of the GBA games are in FE6, but the deck is still stacked against them. They're not entirely useless since they can still provide distance chip damage and shoot at wyverns. And they're better if you can manage to get them to promote, just like pawns. But in Project Ember, which is player phase focused, as we discussed earlier, your archers start to shine a lot more. Since you want to minimize the amount of enemy phase combat, it doesn't matter too much that archers can't attack at one range on enemy phase, since your other units are able to do that better anyway. And frankly, this would be great for archers even without any change to bow ranges. But Project Ember also reduces the overall usefulness of early game 1-2 range weapons and grants enemies access to more powerful range weapons before you get access to them. So to keep with the player phase focus of the gameplay, Project Ember needs to provide a way to hit them on player phase without letting them hit back, and it does that with bows. Of course, archers aren't the only class that can use bows. In addition to the nomads, Wendy and Tobias can use bows. Well, generals can too, and so can Galley. But archers and snipers are undisputed masters of the bow, with plenty of special bows that are either personal weapons or locked generally to archers and snipers. The refined bow, the recurve bow, and the hunting bow give your archers and snipers the ability to handle specific enemy types or land critical hits reliably enough to take down high HP, low defense units at one round. Still, the non-archer bow users have their utility. Knights and generals are great bow users on enemy phase since they can take physical attacks more reliably, and since they tend to have higher strength, they're great at using the 310 range longbow. Galley's fun to use as an endgame bow user because he can help with all the wyverns in Chapter 23. Of course, the bow range change cuts both ways here. Enemy units with bows are a lot scarier now. You can't simply send in units that counter at 2 range and call it a day anymore, because they'll get shot at 3 range. You have to deal with the archers on player phase by closing in quickly, shooting them with Walt's refined bow that he can get in Chapter 8 by talking with Alina, or using your own bows on enemy phase. Enemy nomads, bow-wielding generals, and such are scary as all hell on paper, but they're a fun challenge to figure out how to beat. They don't feel anywhere near impossible as long as you're prepared for them. And since Fire Emblem as a series already heavily emphasizes preparation, it should come as no surprise that Project Ember does too. That said, I can see critics' point that the bow range being applied so universally can be a little overbearing in certain situations. And admittedly, I shied away from it at first because it was difficult to break old habits to account for it. In an ideal world, I think the Project Ember team would have given extra bow range to archers and snipers as a class skill, rather than make almost all bows have more range, while letting generals and nomads continue to use bows at 2 range. But FE6 ROM hacking hasn't advanced to that point yet. The skill system commonly found in many ROM hacks is exclusive to FE8, so achieving this would require making FE6 and FE8's engine. And besides being a massive undertaking, it would also miss the spirit of what an overhaul is. To change the original game within the bounds of its engine. And it's not like FE6 can't handle Project Ember's changes. Bow users now are the undisputed masters of ranged attacks. Allied bow users are incredible resources that you should use and shield with your other units. And enemy bow users should be among your primary targets that you should have a plan for taking out quickly. The bow range change is one of the best examples of the Project Ember team's intent to overhaul the game because it's so interconnected with the patch's other changes, particularly to units and weapon hit rates. And I can't argue with results. The game is a different experience. It presents new challenges and gives you the tools to overcome them. I pulled it up because it's one of the most blatant changes Project Ember makes, and from what I can tell, it's one of the most criticized. But I don't want to take away attention from changes that I think people can generally agree are good, even if analyzed on their own. So let's open the door leading to Part 3. Wait, wasn't there a wall here before? Chapter 8 is objectively one of the most boring, badly designed maps in the Binding Blade, and definitely ranks high in the list of the worst maps of the series. And I can prove this with facts and logic. Chapter 8 wastes an incredible amount of space in the top third of the map. Rescuing your foot units with cavalry makes things go faster, but there will still be turns where you're basically doing nothing except moving units around and dealing with a weak enemy or two here and there. You know what Chapter 8 reminds me of? Chapter 8 is like when drug dealers mix cocaine with laundry detergent just so they have more powdery stuff to sell. They take something potentially fun and dilutes it with needless quantity in order to raise funds to overthrow the democratically elected government of Ostia and turn it into a puppet state. Anyway, map design. Chapter 8 is the most blatant example of FE6's map design methodology, but other maps are very artificially roundabout as well. I suspect it's because there were technical limitations on the total area of maps, but also a high market demand at the time for games that took a long time to beat. So intelligent systems decided to have units zig and zag their way through maps, or they designed maps in ways that split units into 2 groups to provide a longer, strategic experience. In reality though, the games that use this design strategy the most also tend to be the most tedious, because there are many times where your units are just rounding corners. It's definitely not a design strategy that aged well, to say the least. By contrast, Chapter 8 of Project Ember is one of the smoothest chapters in the game. Now there's a set of double doors to bypass much of the top of the map, and a breakable wall in the leftmost treasure room. It also clears out some doors and walls, particularly in the top left corner of the map, which makes protecting the units you get there a lot more interesting. Now most of your turns aren't simply spent moving units around, you're actually doing stuff on the way to Legance, like taking out enemies or snagging treasure. A lot of the windier maps in the game get a touch-up like this actually. Chapters 3 and 16 are other great examples of maps that benefit from this new design philosophy of giving units ways to duck under the annoying winding queue barriers. I don't really do LTC stuff, at least not publicly, but Project Ember was the first game that made me consider seriously trying it. And while these changes are great time savers, their main advantage is that they improve the flow of play. To explain what I mean by this, I'm going to go on a brief tangent about first-person shooters. Many of these games are designed to pit players who are on the move against players who are locking down an area. Counter-Strike's bomb and hostage scenarios are a great example of this, as well as Call of Duty's Search and Destroy, and Capture the Flag style modes, and many shooters. Maps made for these game modes are free of major dead ends, and each main subsection of a map has multiple entry points, making it a team effort to attack or defend each area. Maps like Counter-Strike's Dust 2 or Unreal Tournament's Deck 16 encourage cyclical movement in and around the map. They use transitions between long corridors and open areas to provide different key shootout locations, and different types of weaponry available in these games have different levels of utility within different parts of these maps. The goal of this design in shooters is to emphasize the importance of how, when, and where you and your teammates move. These are effectively tactical decisions, and that translates really well to strategy RPGs. These games keep players under constant pressure to use every second to get closer to completing a main objective, or to rack up kills while under attack. A good Fire Emblem map applies that same kind of pressure to players by emphasizing objectives like seizing, as well as side objectives like recruiting a new unit or snagging treasure. The element of physical reaction time isn't there, of course, but it's simulated somewhat by the limits on the number of turns you have to complete a task. Yes, the lack of doors in the middle of the treasure room in Chapter 8 lets you access the treasure more quickly, but it lets Kath access the treasure more quickly too, and the Project Ember team expects you to have an answer for that. They've shown that they understand this need to apply time-based pressure to the player, and the changes they've made to some of FE6's maps, and they're now more of an interesting challenge in the test of patience that they were in FE6. Maps also have some palette changes to give the settings of each chapter some more variety, and frankly the overall aesthetic of Project Ember is really something to behold. There's new music sprinkled in, as well as new makeovers given to unit map sprites, battle sprites, and portraits. You can tell that the Project Ember team didn't just put thought into how their game would play, but how it would look and sound to those who play it. And that brings me to my final point that I want to cover when it comes to Project Ember's awesomeness. Part 4. Labor of Love. In the game modding world, people make mods for the games they love. Spite can definitely be a great motivator, especially if someone tells you that you won't be able to do something. But people don't typically waste time on games they don't find fun, and modders are no exception to this rule. They might notice certain features they dislike and make mods to remove or bypass them, but overhauls don't really work this way. They're too all-encompassing and affect too many systems. That's a lot of time and effort to spend on a game you don't even like, you know? So it's passion, not spite, that drives an effort to reimagine and enhance a good thing. And Project Ember is a passion product in every possible way. While overhauls often paint broad strokes here and there, it's the tiny details of Project Ember that really shine through the most to me. The Project Ember team clearly had a good idea of the kind of experience they wanted their patch's players to have. There are too many little changes to count, but some of the ones that stick out to me the most include being able to check total enemy ranges, and the fact that poison is just gone, no poison weapons to deal with or antitoxins to discard. Now speaking of weapons, tomes have new effects now. Being able to call for reinforcements via Douglas in a similar manner to how Tanith works in Path of Radiance is pretty cool. These are all great and they feel like they fit right into FE6 as if they were always there. Then there's a little Easter eggs. The smallest possible change I can think of in Project Ember is that Hugh has an E rank in Dark Magic. An astute Fire Emblem player might ask, wait, is Flux E rank in Project Ember now? It was always D rank. And I would answer, no, it's still D rank here. Hugh's E rank has no combat function whatsoever. So why is it there? Because Hugh used to use Dark Magic and now he doesn't. You see, in Hugh's supports with Nime, it's clear Granny is disappointed in him. She sent him off to study Dark Magic, he lost his Nosferatu tome to Rei, and he practices Anima Magic now, which also possibly kind of runs in his family, but he still has his basic training, hence his E rank. It's a remnant of his past, a sign that his ancestry and upbringing still looms over him. And this is attention to detail and a bit of comic relief rolled into a single change of a single value in FE Builder. Those supports that establish all of this drama aren't exclusive to Project Ember either, they're all in FE6. So this simply reinforces what exists in Elysian history in a funny way. The new support conversations for Project Ember go to those units that are nearly playable. These conversations are some of the best I've ever read in a Fire Emblem game, yet they read like they were always there initially. I would take the Elwood Marcus support conversation, where the two reflect on their legacies as knights as they each near the end of their mortality, over the dozens of frankly forgettable support conversations throughout the series, where the character is just hungry or afraid of ghosts, or not a kid anymore. Yeah, I get that you're short, Caspar, you told me 6 times already, now please stop screaming, Jesus. There are also a few new talk conversations that are available for one chapter only that are also really good at fleshing out characters' pre-established personalities. My favorite one is between Lena and Wolt in Chapter 8, the one where Wolt gets the refined bow. It gives Wolt a renewed purpose both in narrative and gameplay terms, and it reinforces Lena's personality as outgoing and idealistic. Compare this with Lena's conversation with Tobias in the same chapter, should you recruit him in Chapter 7, and just to be clear, you totally should, just look at this guy, he's amazing. Anyway, in this conversation, Lena is more reticent, a bit slower to accept Tobias' presence. But ultimately, she chooses to wait and see what Tobias does with the trust Roy's army has placed in him thus far. This attitude matches closely with how Lelina interacts with recruitable enemy units Gonzalez and Garrett. These conversations all serve as ways of establishing Lelina's personality as someone who believes in second chances. Then there's also the fact that Project Ember's design philosophy applies to specialty game modes like 0% growths, Maniac Mode, Reverse Recruitment, Weapon Reversal, and such. You'd think that these would break the player phase focus setup that Project Ember employs, but no, it's pretty playable in my experience. And the changes in each patch show an interesting attention to detail. For example, in the Reverse Recruitment with Trial Map Units patch, Percival replaces Lena and Hector replaces Wolt. So when they talk in Chapter 8, Hector gets a refined axe, a 1-2 range axe that is effective against archers just like the refined bow was. And while Wolf is able to counter at 3 range with a refined bow, Hector is not. Now you have to play more aggressively with the refined axe, which is a bit easier since Hector is a tanky knight. Various personal weapons are changed in reverse recruitment too, so that you get them in the same chapter as you normally would, on the replacement units. Raid's Soul Steel changes into Wendy's Soul Spear, for example. They have similar effects, but one is a Dark Tome and one is a Lance. It's a pretty neat way to make reverse recruitment more interesting than just the same units as regular recruitment but backwards. And it shows just how well tested these modes are too. Weapons still feel like they belong in their modes despite how different it feels to use them. And ultimately, every change in Project Ember, when viewed as a single package, feels like it all belongs together. It's not a bunch of patchwork changes thrown into the pile in the hopes that it might all work out. But it is a carefully crafted overhaul by people who understand how to create an engaging Fire Emblem experience. In conclusion, Project Ember is not meant to be a replacement for the Binding Blade. Its very nature as an overhaul is that it provides something familiar, yet altered, to a player who's in the mood for something different. Project Ember exists in my folder of official Nintendo game cartridges as an alternative to FE6. And I think it should in yours too. And as much as I wish there was a replacement for the Binding Blade, Project Ember is not it, and doesn't pretend to be. The closest thing we'll ever get to replacing the Binding Blade is with an official remake. And even that won't fully replace FE6's legacy within the series' history. I will say, though, that Project Ember is best enjoyed if you've played FE6 first. You can't truly appreciate what Project Ember has done if you haven't at least experienced the original game. And an overhaul can't possibly be judged on its own merit. It will always be compared to the game that it's changing. Obviously, I think Project Ember does a great job at providing a unique experience. Yes, it's a very popular overhaul nowadays, but it owes that popularity to the great work that the team has done on it, and the level of dedication they've shown to crafting it. And it's not the only fan-made Fire Emblem product in this vein. There are others out there and in progress for various Fire Emblem games that you can expect I'll be visiting in the future too. That's it for me. Big thanks to Mecha, Myasis, and Valentine, who looked over this video's script and made editing suggestions and encouraging comments. If you liked the video, consider pressing the like button. It's always nice to see that people enjoy my stuff. I read all the comments I get, so feel free to agree or disagree with my points. Or play Project Ember, that's a good idea too. If you have no idea where to start, play hard mode and work your way up from there. I think you'll have a good time. Anyway, thanks for watching, and have a good one.